has been suggested that Ruth and Naomi of the book of Ruth were romantically involved. Let's take a look. The first problem we have is just how tiny the book of Ruth is. Barely 3 pages. So there isn't much to go on. But maybe what we do have can be looked at in a few different ways. First off, we need to make it plain that women had no power whatsoever. A woman without a man in her life was doomed. She could be a daughter in her father's house or a wife in her husband's house, and that was it. If she was a widow, then she better have a grown son to support her and keep her in his house. There's a reason the Bible is so full of references and commands about caring for widows and orphans. They were the powerless. Genesis 38 even has Judah telling his daughter-in-law Tamar to go back to her father's house because her husband, Judah's son, has died. Note that Judah is still alive, but since his son is dead and left no sons, rather than keep Tamar, Judah sends Tamar back to her own father. This was the reality that women faced. So Naomi and Ruth and Naomi's other daughter-in-law Orpah are all widows because Naomi's husband and the 2 sons all died. All the men are gone. Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to go back to their respective fathers' homes, as Naomi plans to go to her family too. Orpah does this, but Ruth can't. She refuses. And this website I found says that the Hebrew for Ruth clinging to Naomi, the clinging, the word meaning cling, is the same word used to describe how Adam is supposed to cling to Eve, how a husband is supposed to cling to his wife. Not that husbands actually left their families. If anything, it was the woman doing the clinging. But let's set that aside. We are told that a man is to cling to his wife, to leave all other ties that bind behind, set his wife first, and the 2 shall be one flesh. Okay, so the same word cling is being used for both Adam and Eve and for Ruth and Naomi. And given what a woman's position was, without a man in her life, Ruth is indeed making a very bold and dangerous choice here. When she says, "Where you die, I will die," she was openly acknowledging the very real threat that following Naomi, instead of going back to her proper place, could result in her death. Ruth is willing to risk death to be with Naomi. We go on to see Ruth care for Naomi by taking the only job available to a woman without a man in her life, gleaning. Gleaning is when landowners hire servants to harvest their crops. Gleaning is following behind those servants and searching for any crops that the official harvesters missed. Women were at least allowed to do that. Of course, Ruth is noticed. And what's more, when Ruth asked Boaz, the owner of the fields she gleans in, why he was kind to her and gave his harvesters directions to deliberately leave grain behind for her, he answered that Ruth's actions regarding Naomi were well known in the village. And when Ruth tells this to Naomi, what Boaz has done for her, the 2 women contrive together to get Ruth married to Boaz. Ruth, on Naomi's instructions, actually goes to the threshing floor while Boaz is sleeping. A very interesting trick. It is clearly painted as a marriage of convenience. And when I say clearly, I do mean that. The Bible shows very clearly that this whole deal was a matter of maintaining the dead man's name on his family inheritance. This is called levirate marriage. When a man died leaving a wife but no sons, his brother or nearest male kin was supposed to take on the widow as his own and sleep with her to produce a son, and this son would carry on the dead man's family name. So you could be biologically one man's son, but legally, for inheritance purposes, the son of someone else. And now we get why I mentioned Judah and Tamar earlier, because here they are, being referenced in Ruth. We see that Tamar bore sons to Judah. After Judah sent Tamar away, he failed to send his youngest son to do the required levirate marriage. So Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute and had sex with Judah. And later, when Tamar was found pregnant, Judah was going to have her killed for playing the whore. Actual words used. Fortunately, Tamar was smart and had Judah's own staff and signet to prove who had impregnated her. Judah and Tamar was for the sake of continuing an inheritance, a family line. And now here, Ruth and Boaz are compared. So they definitely had a marriage of convenience. This does not mean Boaz is a bad person. He is shown to be a good man. He is kind to Ruth, generosity and gentleness about that thing on the threshing floor. He's an honorable man. So Ruth and Boaz get married and come together. Nice euphemism there, my dear Bible translation. And Ruth bore a son. And what do the women of the village say? Well, first they say how Ruth is more to Naomi than 7 sons. And I'm told 7 is an important number. So that declaration is very high praise. And then they say that a son has been born to Naomi. But Ruth gave birth. Now, I know Bible writers sometimes like to skip a generation when recording genealogies, but while the mother is still alive? And what's more, other genealogies have the husband mentioned as the one a son is born to. Just higher up here, we have Tamar bearing a son to Judah. So to have a son born to Naomi is interesting. So is the phrase that Naomi became the child's nurse, given that Naomi herself had stated earlier that she was too old to bear children. It certainly sounds as if they were raising the son together. Clearly, the most important relationship for Ruth and Naomi is the one they had with each other. The Bible does not outright say it was romantic, unless there's a Hebrew language detail I don't know, which is possible. I don't know Hebrew. But there are 2 things I want to point out. The first is Ruth's declaration. It has been used at weddings. A lot. I even have this ghost of a memory of singing a song at a wedding that used Ruth's words. Because when you are raised by a choir teacher, you start singing in public at 6 years old. Let's see. Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, my God. Whither thou goest, I will go. That's all I remember. Anyone recognize it? So I find it very interesting that these verses from Ruth were popular enough at weddings to be put into a song. So that means there are enough people out there who do feel these words are spousal. even if they hush over where the words came from. And then there's this thought experiment that the website suggests. To imagine two women coming to a conservative-type religious leader and saying, "We want to live together, make a vow of love to each other, and raise children together, without husbands." Of course, the religious leader would say, "No, certainly not." But if the women say, "Oh, we'll be celibate. We won't get physical. We'll just live our lives with each other and raise children without husbands," would the conservative religious leader now be okay with this arrangement? Can you imagine the anti-gay crowd saying, "Okay, these two women can make this vow of love and live together and raise kids without husbands as long as they are celibate"? Can you see that? I don't see that. Because it's not actually the sex that anti-gays have an issue with, I think. It's the idea of two women who love each other instead of loving men. And that is why the love between Ruth and Naomi is so important. The relationship between Ruth and Naomi does not have to be physical in order to challenge the status quo. The book of Ruth makes it quite plain that a relationship between two women can be every bit as important, if not more important, than a relationship between a woman and a man. What's more, the book of Ruth makes it equally plain that such a strong relationship between two women is something to be celebrated.